Hi everybody, foXnoMad here, and today I want to help you travel smarter by sharing a recent episode of the foXnoMad podcast with you. My guest is D.A. Galloway. He's a former tour guide of Yellowstone National Park. He's also a researcher and author who's written the book Burning Ground, which talks about the founding of Yellowstone National Park, but also goes into the history of the indigenous peoples who have lived there for centuries, as well as some of the natural beauty and things you might not have known about the park. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. So here you go. Here's my interview with D.A. Galloway. All right, there we go. Thank you again for joining the podcast. I've been interested to speak with you, David, because we're sort of, I feel like, in a resurgence of interest in the Wild West, if you will. Maybe not Wild West, but in the West, the frontier. And I don't know why that is, but I'm glad that is. I personally read a couple of books recently about the topic, and it's something that, as someone who travels, is just very interesting to me. What brought you to Yellowstone? Let's just start there.
Yes, well, my first experience in Yellowstone was decades ago. I'm not a young man at this point, but when I was a young man, going to university in the late 70s, I was fortunate enough to apply to and be accepted to be employed by what is termed generically the park concessioner in Yellowstone National Park. And for those of your listeners who may not be familiar with that, you surely, if you've been to any park or any place where they have the kinds of things that the visitors and those touring the area would appreciate, such as things like restaurants or service stations or motels or anything there that caters to the needs of the people visiting a facility. So the Yellowstone Park Company was the uh, a contracted concessionaire for Yellowstone National Park, and they provided those various services in that very, very large park. And I was employed initially, Anil, as a dock hand. So anyone who has, if you've not been to Yellowstone, Yellowstone has a very large lake. It's the second largest alpine lake in the Western Hemisphere after Lake Titicaca in Peru, and meaning above 8,000 feet. And so it's an extremely large lake, and they have a marina there where you can take tours, hire a fishing guide, take out a small outboard motor. And I was hired as a dockhand in that marina. And very quickly, fortunately for me, I was able to transition from a dockhand to a tour guide because they were short a tour guide, someone who would drive the scenic cruise boats in a 1 hour tour around the lake. And they trained me to operate the boat and to learn the commentary that I would provide while I drove that boat. So, in a nutshell, that's how I got to Yellowstone, and that's what I did there in the 70s.
Wow. And it seems, I mean, Yellowstone is a huge park. How do you do the guides have one section that they focus on, or does it just take a really long time to kind of learn it all?
Well, it's quite a bit of information. You're right. By the way, so just to give you some idea of perspective, it's 2.2 million acres. That's how large Yellowstone is, the park boundaries. And what I had to learn at least the basics about all parts of the park, because while I was driving that boat, a 45 passenger boat around Stevenson Island, which is the large island in the north of the lake, I was trying to give people in that time some appreciation for what they were seeing as we were circumnavigating the island. But people wanted to know more about that. They wanted to know more, not just around the lake area, but the other thermal features that everyone is aware of. The famous Old Faithful geyser, there's a Grand Prismatic Spring, there's Mammoth Hot Springs, there's the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. And so I had to know enough of the basic history, geology, cultural impact of the Native Americans to be able to speak to that. but no one can really know all of that. I just had to know the answers to the most common questions and then direct them to a park ranger for say when I didn't know the answer, say I don't know that answer.
And that actually brings up an interesting question. What is the most common Yellowstone question that you got when people were out there?
Yeah, it's well, how I say it, it's sad and humorous at the same time, Anil. Where are all the bears? That was the most common question I got. Is many people wanted to go to the park to see a bear, and at the time, at least in the late '70s when I were there, it was not common to see a bear, believe it or not, and it had gone through periods of time when part of the history, actually early in the park, much of the wildlife, sadly, was almost decimated. Many of the bison, to give you some quick review, at one point in the early 1900s, there were less than 300 bison in the park, if you can imagine, out of a population in northern plains that were estimates between 20 and 30 million. So imagine the recovery of the bison, of the elk, of the wolves, which is controversial unto itself, but all of that is much better shape today than it was 30 or 40 years ago, and certainly a century ago. So I digress a little bit, but the answer to your question is, where are all the bears? Because the bears, we had learned, thankfully, that at one point, the bears were actually very prevalent, black bears especially, and people, they would actually encourage their pictures, photos, uh, uh, in the teens and 20s and 1920s of them bringing tourists to garbage dumps and encouraging them to watch them while the bears fed out of a garbage dump, if you can imagine, in the park, in the park.
Wow. I'm sure that led to some not good encounters. I would.
No, not good for the bears, not good for the people, just poor wildlife management. We've learned and we know much better how to manage among a population that really, as in all wildlife, would prefer to be remain distant from humans.
So, going sort of into the genesis of the book, Burning Ground, which is really the story of the founding of Yellowstone, and I think it's interesting because Yellowstone, when we think of national parks, pretty much anywhere in the world, Yellowstone has got to be maybe the first, or it's world famous, and I don't think many of us know the story of how it was created, but also it is kind of amazing that there's this huge natural area that's left relatively untouched by humanity for this long, well into the into 2022. So how did that all happen? Is it just luck? Is it happenstance?
Yes, sort of, maybe. uh, so I'll try to condense it. But the in 1869, let's start there. In 1869, there was a small group of Europeans, white men, uh, who who conducted a little bit of a survey into the park briefly and documented some of their findings. Uh, the following year, in 1870, there was another group that we know from their writings and their recordings and so forth. It was called the Washburn Langford Doan expedition. They went into the park, into the thermal areas, and came back with documented would have been heretofore a lot of legends and myths, but no one really uh, had surveyed the park and really had come up with anything to substantiate what the fur traders and trappers and mountaineers who had gone through the region talked about. Well, they actually confirmed many of these things. And then that leads us to 1871, where what I would call a seminal event for the founding of the park. And this is why. In 1871, a geologist by the name of Ferdinand van de Veer Hayden, Hayden, was commissioned by Congress. He was appropriated funds to, and they supported him in a very large, truly scientific expedition of the Yellowstone region in Wyoming Territory. And how large was it? He had about 35 or 36 men with him, scientists, most of them, and support personnel. And he had a military escort of about the same size to provide protection in as they went through the park. And they spent 38 days uh, going around the park in all of its areas. And with them now, they had the means by which they could truly measure and document things. So they had ornithologists, zoologists, meteorologists, geologists, painters, photographers, map makers. I mean, they had truly, it was a scientific expedition. So they were taking samples, they were taking temperatures of thermal springs, they were photographing, they were painting, they were. So in these 38 days, a tremendous amount of information, duly documented and sampled, was gathered. That information from the 1871 so-called Hayden expedition was then presented, or at least the preliminary report by Hayden was presented to Congress later that year, along with the photographs of William Henry Jackson, first black and white photographs ever taken of the area, Thomas Moran paintings, colored paintings of these wonderful thermal features and canyons and rivers and so forth. Imagine if you're a member of Congress and now you see before you samples of flora and fauna and photographs and paintings of this wonderland. How could you not vote to say, this is so extraordinary, we need to set this land aside? And sure enough, the very next year, in March 1st of 1872, 150 years ago this year, President Grant signed into law the Park Preservation Act, which established the world's first national park. So that was a little bit of a long history lesson, but an important one to understand how the birth of the park kind of came out of some expeditions, and how that convinced the political will of the Congress to set aside this land just for, in quotes, in the Park Preservation Act of Neil. It's often paraphrased, and it's appropriate. It's set aside, quote, for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. So it's a wonderful story of the founding, and that's part of the wonderment of why I wanted to set my novel in that 1871 timeframe, because it's such a wonderful time, a genesis of the park system itself.
And I guess this is a silly question, but it almost goes contrary to what we think, right? We think of this natural land. Maybe Congress would want to exploit it, or make a settlement there. So it's surprising, right? Almost to create a park there.
It is, and I'm glad you brought that up, Anil, because but for a year or so, and but for a couple other circumstances, Yellowstone could be Las Vegas. And that sounds almost absurd, but it wasn't. In fact, here's the astounding part. There were people in 1871, while the Hayden expedition was there, that already had made land claims within the park borders, and were planning to, for example, there was a fellow there who was already setting up bathhouses at Mammoth Hot Springs, because they were mineral springs, like Sarasota Springs, like the hot springs in Arkansas. They have curative, they're beneficial healing in those waters, those mineral waters. And he was going to make a commercial use of that. the Northern Pacific Railway had talked about putting a railroad through the center of the Yellowstone territory. Imagine what it would look like if there was a railroad. But for a few things happening, it almost came to pass. A railroad. They talked about putting an elevator from the top of the canyon down to the bottom of the Yellowstone River near the falls. All of that was but for a few people who said time out. We are not going to do this. But there was a time when it was on the edge. I would say, is this going to be a true natural land we preserve and protect, or are we going to commercialize it in some great sense that frankly would have spoiled everything that makes it, in my view, so wonderful in its natural state?
Wow. Wow. I guess we've all gotten very lucky that those things didn't happen. And it seems like Yellowstone created the precedent for all the other national parks.
It
So
did. It was the world's first national park, and that it became the model for not just in America but worldwide. Other countries said, as someone once said, it's one of America's best ideas was a national park, and thankfully other countries saw the value in preserving and protecting the beautiful lands that they have in their country.
and now in the late 1800s, this was a pretty wild. I mean, this was not the United States we know today, right? I mean, this was dangerous. There were, I mean, still a lot of the land was under, Indian and indigenous people's control, as far as I understand it. So that these expeditions were pretty dangerous, and not just from the land itself, but from, the people who were living there.
Yes, it was. It was, and if I might say right up front, Anil, in my novel, I mean, one of the things that I learned and appreciate even now, much more even than before I did the research uh, for the novel and added to my knowledge of the park, I have a great respect for the indigenous populations because they were there tens of thousands of years before the white man ever showed up, right? It was their land. In fact, the tribal areas around that area, there were many tribal lands. I'm sure I'm going to leave couple out, but just to give you some appreciation, uh, uh, some of the indigenous folks who called part Yellowstone, or they considered it part of their land, and it was sacred to them. It was hunting ground. It was a gathering ground. You had the Crow. You had Nez Perce. You had the Blackfeet. You had the Piegan Blackfeet. You had the Lakota Sioux. You had the Northern Cheyenne. You had the Shoshone. The point here is that many of these tribes uh, often went into the what is now the park area to hunt, to go to. There's a place called Obsidian Cliff where they would go there to. There's a large rhyolite cliff area where that they would harvest and gather obsidian, which is a sharp-edged a rock that they'd use for arrowheads and spears and scrapers and such. And they, for tens of thousands of years, they saw this land as a part of their of the land at which they considered their own. When, of course, when with the westward expansion and with settlement in Montana and the Dakotas, we all know, or most of us know, the history of the conflict that inevitably arose between the European settlers and the indigenous folks of all kinds of tribes. And in 1871, it truly was a dangerous place uh, for the fact that you had largely, mostly folks like tribes like the Blackfeet and Lakota Sioux, who pushed back hard against that westward expansion of settlers and miners and ranchers and the railroad. And they did not want to be placed on a reservation. I cannot blame them. And as a result, they saw any most white men as intruders to their land, rightfully so, I would say.
And did Yellowstone end up being a sort of battlefield? I would imagine we have this huge area of land that's sort of, cordoned off as a national park, right? There are borders, and there's going to be no settlement there from the U.S. What did it become a fighting ground almost?
Uh, no, it did not. Generally speaking. Now, so picture this in your mind's eye. The tribes all around the park, uh, they 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 uh, they were centered on like just north of the park were the Blackfeet, north and east of the park were the Crow, but the Crow were aligned themselves with the U.S. government. They're kind of unique in that sense, and we could talk about the history of that later. But the Lakota Sioux to the east and northeast of the park, the Cheyenne to the east. I mean, the most of their land were outside of the park region. They would take forays into the park region. So there were technically no battles. One exception being the Nez Perce in 1877 in Yellowstone. Um, Most of the battles, the battlegrounds, and the conflicts arose in the center of those other territories surrounding the park.
Interesting. And you brought up a very interesting point as well about the Crow aligning themselves with the U.S. government. Why did that occur? It seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is. But there was a chief of the Crow. One of the reasons, but the Crow were very small people relative to their enemies. Their prime enemies were the Blackfeet and the Sioux, the Lakota Sioux. They were much larger tribes. They were just by sheer numbers, they had more warriors. So and so they saw an opportunity to say, how can we possibly? We are outnumbered. We don't have the weapons, right, to really fight these our enemies. Think about this: the domino effect. The white settlers and miners and ranchers are squeezing the territory of the Blackfeet and the Lakota Sioux, which in turn they're squeezing the territory of the Crow. And so this all precipitated in conflicts between not just between white men and indigenous people, but between the tribes themselves, because those areas were being compressed and challenged. The Crow said the only way we're going to survive as a people is if we align ourselves with the U.S. government. They clearly have I mean, it was pretty clear they had the means, they had the technology, they had the overwhelming force. We ally themselves with them, we will end up in a better place in the long run, even if we might be on a reservation, if we ally ourselves with them, and that's why they made that choice.
And did that alliance include helping with exploring the park and sort of understanding, all the parts that were unexplored for the expeditions?
The Crow were not active participants in the exploration of the park. They clearly knew the area. Their main alliance was with uh, as they were recruited and contracted as scouts for the cavalry, and in from early 1870s to the late 1870s, those scouts were critical part of the cavalry's reconnaissance when they were fighting, especially the Lakota Sioux. In fact, history tells us that the Crow and the Arikara tribe, those scouts were critical, were participants, key participants in, for example, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So they saw it was a twofold thing, right? Ally ourselves with the government, uh, be friends with them, and we will end up with a better place in the long run. At the same time, we have a chance to fight our mortal enemies, the Sioux. So that's how the Crow aligned themselves and then ultimately fought against the Sioux by by uh, by working with the U.S. Army and the cavalry.
And as for the surveyors, the people who are going out there, are these people who had maybe been, in the Midwest, who had been exploring other parts, maybe Texas, the sort of the as things pushed westward, or were these people who are, from the cities or just fresh? I can't imagine there were too many of those, like city folk going out there, but what kind of
Well,
people?
it was actually an interesting blend, and Hayden himself, this he'd done a series of geological, and he was a geologist by trade. So he worked for the USGS, but he had done a number of series of surveys in Colorado, in the Dakotas, in Nebraska. He had already done a number of these surveys, geological surveys. So he was an experienced geologist and survey member. So he was an obvious choice to lead this expedition. So he selected people who were uh, frankly, it was a mix. It was a mix of people who he truly needed, people he truly trusted and wanted. They were true scientists in their day, but at the same time, there were people who were political appointees, for lack of a better term. They were political appointees because guess what? Congress funded it. Um, uh, and so he found himself taking on people in the expedition that were not by choice, but were basically said, for political purposes, it would behoove me to take the son of a senator who was actually a part of the expedition. I mean, he knew where his bread was buttered, right? So that young man got to go along, and there were some folks who really uh, had no qualifications per se, but it was the right thing to do. In addition, one of the sponsors was the Smithsonian Institution, who they really wanted a lot of samples for that museum, and so they asked for some folks to be engaged, but for scientific reasons. I mean, you would want those folks to be along, and there were some folks who were frankly they trained as medical doctors, but went because they were scientifically trained, they served in other capacities. So it was an eclectic, interesting mix of folks. But in the long run, they really got the information, the samples, the photographs, and the paintings that really became the foundation for convincing Congress of the unique area.
And what are some of the dangers? I guess then and now, I'm assuming a lot of the dangers are probably the same if you just wandered into the park on your own. What were some of the dangers of just showing up and really not having much of an idea, aside from maybe what the scouts have told you, what you've got from the traders who had been? But there's not a lot to go on, I don't think.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up because, well, imagine this. I mean, if you're a park visitor now, even if you've never been there, you've seen pictures, and many of the pictures, they will have pictures of not only the features, but you will notice there's boardwalks, there's signs, there's roads, there's buildings, right? Imagine going in there when none of that existed. I mean, the indigenous folks had been through there for thousands of years, but if you are actually exploring that area for the first time, here's a good question. How close can I get to that hot spring before falling in?
Ah,
Right. I mean, the the boardwalks were not there. There was no sign saying stay back, right? There was no say stay on the boardwalk, don't wander off here. The crust is thin here. This spring is very hot. None of that there. And so it was an adventure so that was one example, right? Another example of the first boat by a European, at least, on Yellowstone Lake. And I can appreciate this having driven a boat, a modern boat on the lake. was constructed on land. They were gonna, right, and they pieced it together. It was a canvas covered wooden hulled frame with a horse blanket for a sail, and they sailed this small two-person boat out on the lake, a very deep lake, which averages in the upper 30s in temperature for water temperature, and is over 300 feet deep. That's not something that, having been out on that lake and as large as it is, I could tell you, and the weather changes in an instant in Yellowstone. If you'd be caught out on that lake in a storm in that boat, they called it the Annie. Uh, if you, well, you wouldn't have made it back to shore. So I mean, there's the, and then there's the wildlife, the grizzlies. You know, probably one of the main, you know, a mother grizzly is nothing to be fooled with. Even if you are armed, she will fight to the death. And so there was lots of perils there, mainly because it was unknown.
And so I guess bringing it to today, how is the park different? I mean, you mentioned a couple of things like the roads and the boardwalks. Are there any other parts of it that have stayed the same? I mean, is it vastly the same, the wild areas, or are there other changes that one would notice, I guess, from those days?
It is largely, thankfully, largely unchanged. Now, and so wisely, it took a few decades to realize this. One thing we haven't talked about, Neil, yet is that the park. Before I get to that, let me just give you a little bit of another piece of history that's fascinating. The park, it's easy to write. Well, I'll say so. In 1872, but with a stroke of the pen, Yellowstone National Park is established. But not to be too cynical, but the Congress, as in many of the laws that are passed today, not to get too political, but the fact of the matter is, but there was nothing passed to supplement that law, right? There was no staff. There were no staff. There was no enforcement. There was nothing there to, they said, we're going to preserve, protect this area. But in fact, there was no teeth to that law. So poachers were prevalent for the first 2 or 3 decades in the park. They would, I mean, they continued within, they would kill with impunity the wildlife in that park because you know, people still wanted buffalo heads and buffalo hides. People would still you know, still thought of wolves as vermin that needed to be exterminated. People still hunted elk in the area. I mean, in the park, and but there was a superintendent in the first couple years with zero staff to cover 2.2 million acres. How practical does that sound, right? So, long story short, from 1872 until I believe this is right, 1886 or 1888, that's when the park actually transferred temporarily from the Department of Interior to the Army. And the Army actually, the U.S. Army actually managed the park for some 30 years, from
Wow.
1886 to 1916. Uh, and they actually were the first governmental organization. And in 1916, the National Park Service was founded, and then we know today the Park Service was founded, and then the Department of Interior took over management of it. But in many ways, the U.S. Army saved Yellowstone National Park because there heretofore there was no way to manage and control and enforce the laws of what had been established as a national park with by no means to hold people accountable for violating any of the laws that were passed with it. So if that makes sense, right? So there's a little history. I'm answering your question, but for that intervention of the U.S. Army, well, there were already people were defacing spraying graffiti and writing their names on features, and like I said, poaching animals, and they would get away with it because there was no one to really manage or control any of that. Or meanwhile, tourists were continuing to come in. You needed somebody to figure out how to manage these folks, and it was in fact the army until 1916.
And at that time, was maintaining the park, as far as the government was concerned, was that something of national sort of pride? Was it because there was tourism income potential? I mean, that's it. To me, it seems like a pretty early concept of tourism. Or was it maybe we'll need this land for something else in the future?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. In reality, um, if you think about it, in those early years and the turn of the last century, there were many entrepreneurs who were needed it very rapidly went from a couple hundred people in its first years to tens of thousands of people to hundreds of thousands of people at the turn visiting the park. So there were entrepreneurs who would try, build and set up a hotel. There was stagecoach service. So obviously, before the automobile, there were folks who had set up a stagecoach service to provide. You get off the railroad, the train, in Montana and in Bozeman or Billings, and then they would provide stagecoach service into the park and in tours around the park. And so you needed, and there were hotels, simple little shanties and log cabins, and got a little bit more extravagant there. And so, and yet, I think, frankly, in looking back, I think there was the government as a managing entity was struggling with the balance between how do we provide what is needed for clearly this tourist destination, and balance that with protecting the park, yet still do it in a way where we don't spoil the landscape, the very landscape that people want to see. Thankfully, the elevator was not built in the Grand Canyon, right? The railroad did not go through the park. So they had enough people pushing back to say, look, let's provide what we need to do to serve this, to allow people to see the park, but let's draw some clear lines of we will not spoil the landscape. And for the most part, I think that was successful.
And in the research of the book, you go into the details of really this expedition of founding the park. What was the research like? What kind of records were you able to get a hold of? What exists, and how easy or difficult was it to sort of get a hold of all that information?
Well, the main there were a couple of main sources that I relied on heavily. There's quite a bit of Yellowstone history that's documented. Although those early years, it's really confined to a few things. Hayden's actual, he called it the fifth report. It was his fifth geological survey, is in the public domain in the National Archives, and he documented it is voluminous. It is hundreds of pages, but it's very detailed. Um, it has maps that were drawn. Uh, it has descriptions of geological features, and the other thing that was really helpful, and I relied on heavily, were a couple of key members of Hayden's team kept personal diaries. So at the end of each day, they would literally handwrite, what they experienced or what they saw or what happened that day. And I find that was frankly the foundational part of my um, uh, story, because leading up to my novel, what I did was, let me take what actually happened and what I knew happened through the eyes of people who had been there, and imagine a protagonist, a modern day protagonist, traveling back in time and being with that Hayden expedition in the 38 days, day by day, as they traversed across this land that few people had seen, and imagine the interactions he would have with that group. That was the research that was critical for me to make to blend historical events with a fictional character.
Wow, that's fascinating. I will leave a link to the book in the show notes. But as we wrap up things, I just have one final question. There's been a lot of talk about the status of the parks in recent years, funding for the parks, or using, or maybe using the parks for drilling, or these kind of things. What is the status of the national parks in Yellowstone? Are we taking them for granted in a sense? Could they potentially shrink or disappear, as there are more and more of us, right? So like people are expanding. Is that something that's happening, and how can we protect those areas?
Well, that's interesting. Going forward, I don't. I'm just going to give you one man's opinion. That's only my opinion. Um, and maybe I'm an optimist, but it is my view. I sincerely believe that um, I don't believe we're going to shrink our national parks. I think to the contrary, we're going to find more areas that need protection. I, I maybe that's optimistic, but I believe that to be true. And history tells us that's to be true, because every year there are some areas we find that need some kind of, some say, let's make sure that we let's not in let's be wise about this. So that's, as a general statement, that is my belief, and I think there are enough people who would align with that, that there would be huge pushback on the exploitation of it. Now, there's always going to be that tension, right, between exploitation and commercial use versus setting aside. We have that in our national forests, and whether we use the resources for our national forests for as an example. But the parks are unique in that regard, in that they are not meant um, to be exploited commercially in any way. And I would like to believe that there will always be a strong political will, regardless of where you are on the spectrum, to say that this is sacrosanct. We will not go back on centuries of a great idea and decide that we are going to make an exception here and start using it for commercial purposes. So there are more of us, Anil, you're absolutely right. But although it may sound paradoxical, my view is that should not be a reason for us to say, yeah, but what if, should we deny people the opportunity to go see the parks? No, we should not. We need to get creative in figuring out how to manage the huge influx of people who want to go to our national parks. Yellowstone set an attendance record last year. Nearly 5 million people visited that park. When I was a tour guide there in the late 70s, Anil, half that number were there. And the infrastructure has not changed dramatically in those 40 years, but we have twice as many people. So that, I mean, it's a challenge, but we just got to find ways to go in the off season, go to the places that are less popular. There are things you can do to go, and if we have, and some parks are saying you got to have we only let so many people in at a time. If that's what we have to do, that's what we have to do. But do not put up a "you are not permitted here" sign. That's not the answer either.
Well, I share your optimism. I definitely hope that that we value those areas, just because the natural world, once it's gone, right, we can't build a Yellowstone, right? We can build plenty of Las Vegases, but we can't build a Yellowstone. And I really appreciate your time. This conversation has just made me more fascinated about these areas and the national parks and Yellowstone, which I haven't been to yet, which is
Oh my, Neil. Well, you are currently in Colorado. You're only one state away.
yeah, I'm very close. And it's just a place that I've always wanted to visit. And for some reason, I just keep putting it off. I don't know why.
Well, if I may say in closing here, Neil, my novel, Burning Ground, I just want to mention that going back to the indigenous people. That name of that ground is so apropos, in my view, my humble view, because that's what the Crow Indians called Yellowstone. They called it the land of burning ground. And isn't once you are there, Neil, anyone who goes there and visits those thermal areas, the geyser basins, and if you could look out across that landscape and see the land on fire, which is what you are seeing because you're looking at the remnants of a ancient volcanic caldera that exploded 600,000 years ago, and you're seeing what you're seeing is the surface remnants of that. How can you not fall in love with a place like that? There's like nowhere else like that on Earth than in Yellowstone. The highest concentration of geysers and hot springs in the world in Yellowstone.
Wow. Well, I think I'm just moving it higher up to my. It's always been at the top of my list, but sometimes it's one of those things where I feel like, oh, I'll just get around to it. But I don't think I'll put it off too much longer. And I think people listening too who haven't been or maybe have been but not, in a while. I think you've really sort of inspired us to go to Yellowstone. I really appreciate your time. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I will, like as I mentioned, link to the book in the show notes. Everybody, you can download it, buy it, get a hard copy, and read about this really fascinating look at the people, you know, who what it was like to go there. I mean, I think it's crazy. I think that's just absolutely crazy. Imagine just getting lost in the park today with a phone and with modern clothes, not easy.
The only thing I would ask your listeners to do is, if they have not been there before, it goes without saying, is be respectful of the people around you and the land that you are in. Even today, it is sacred ground, not literally to some tribes, and figuratively for the population, the world citizens who visit. Treat it as such. Treat it as sacred ground.
Thank you so much again for your time, David. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to catching up maybe after I have been.
Please do. Thank you, Anil. Thank you for having me.